Well, this has been in the planning for a damn long time. 4 years ago, I promised myself if I made it to 5 Halloween specials, I'd treat myself with a topic I love. And here we are. Yes, throughout Halloween this year, we're going to be taking a look at the life and times of Vincent Price, a frankly legendary actor with over 200 credits to his name, spanning over 5 decades across pretty much every film genre imaginable. Price began his career in 1938 and would slowly establish himself in a number of supporting roles. His first leading horror credit came in 1940 when he appeared in The Invisible Man Returns. But I have plans for that particular film, so today we're going to be taking a look at another of his early horror entries, 1953's House of Wax, a horror thriller adapted from an earlier movie, 1933's Mystery of the Wax Museum. And with this being a very special occasion, I thought I'd welcome back onto the show a simply splendid guest and long-time supporter, Chris from Channel 83. Chris, it's great to have you back.
It's great to be back. As Dan said, I'm Chris, former host of the Channel 83 podcast, current co-host of the Podgasari Kaiju podcast, and future host of the Channel 83 YouTube channel.
Fantastic stuff. So, the plot. Well, House of Wax stars Price as Henry Jarrod, an exceptionally talented wax sculptor with the ability to recreate incredible likenesses of historical figures. Henry obsesses over his work, to the point that he claims that all of the sculptures speak to him and that each one is almost like a child to him. A few years prior, Henry went into business with a gentleman called Matthew. Matthew would fund the creation of a wax museum, and Henry would continuously add to the museum's collection, and eventually the venture would make enough money back that Matthew could collect on his investment. We joined the firm as Matthews arrived at the museum to talk to Henry about the business arrangement. He's starting to get itchy feet about the venture and is looking to cut his losses and move on to other projects. Henry, however, was expecting this and tells Matthew that he's found an investor who's willing to buy him out, plus interest. This investor is Mr. Sidney Wallace, and Henry's arranged a viewing to take place that night to assess Henry's work. And he's very impressed. Sidney makes it clear that he definitely wants to invest in the venture. However, there is a bit of a snag. Sidney has a prior engagement in Egypt that's going to take around about 3 months to sort out, and so, unfortunately, he can't invest right there and then. But, on his return, he's more than happy to get the ball rolling. Sidney leaves, and Henry feels quite satisfied that Sidney's answer will please Matthew. But unfortunately, it doesn't. Matthew says he can't wait 3 months as there's an opportunity presenting itself here and now that he wants to get involved with. So, he proposes a different approach. Matthew suggests that if they torch the building down to the ground, they can claim the insurance money from the accident, and Matthew can go and take his cut of the money and invest elsewhere, while Henry would be left with enough cash to open a new wax museum that would probably be even better than the one he currently has. The suggestion shocks Henry. To him, Matthew's effectively suggesting the murder of his family. He tries to reason with Matthew, but it's all too little too late. Matthew starts setting fires and a fight breaks out between the pair as Henry desperately tries to put out the fires and rescue his sculptures, while Matthew tries to light more fires and get away before the whole place goes up. After an intense tussle, Matthew manages to escape the burning building, but Henry gets trapped inside right at the point of a massive explosion which rips through the museum, destroying everything. Some time passes and we catch up with Matthew, who's managed to claim the entire insurance pot and plans to take a long trip away with his girlfriend Kathy. It looks like everything's going to be smooth sailing from here on in. But later that night, Matthew returns to his office to close up when a mysterious and horrifyingly burnt man sneaks into the office behind him, garrots him, and then makes the murder look like suicide by hanging him in the building's elevator shaft. A short time later, Kathy is preparing for another night on the town with her best friend Sue. everything seems to be going smoothly when that same mysterious burnt-faced man murders Kathy too. Only this time, Sue was around to witness the murder. After a brief chase, she manages to escape him, and after seeking shelter at a neighbour's house, they contact the police. Not one to be outdone though, later the next night, the mysterious burnt-faced man, who definitely isn't Henry, manages to break into the morgue where Kathy is being stored, and with the help of 2 unseen assistants, the stranger manages to steal the body. A few days pass and Sidney Wallace is called to a random address via a letter signed from Henry, which is odd because Henry is presumed dead. Nevertheless, Wallace arrives at the building and is met by none other than Henry, who explains that he managed to escape the exploding building more or less in one piece. Though he can't walk particularly far or well anymore without crutches, and his hands are only good for basic needs and no longer have the dexterity to sculpt. Henry's called Sidney to ask if the investment proposition is still on the table. Since they last spoke, Henry's decided, rather than capturing the purely historical, he instead wants to focus on the exploitation and excess side of things by effectively creating a House of Horrors style exhibit of murder and debauchery, inspired by real events happening in the here and now. The idea being that someone could read about a murder in the paper, and the next day the murderer would be immortalised in wax in the museum. He explains that he has a couple of new assistants, Igor and Leon, to help him sculpt and run the museum, and that he does what he can to help mentor them. Sidney accepts the proposition, and after an intermission, yeah, that's how classy this film is, it has its own intermission card and musical score and everything, we open to the grand and extravagant opening night of Henry's new wax museum.
And what an opening night it is, complete with brand new sculptures of Anne Boleyn, cavemen, and guillotines, and a carnival barker with a paddle ball pestering passersby and just begging them to give him a swift punch to the face. Henry Jared relishes playing master of ceremonies to his patrons and revels in shocking them with his grotesque new exhibits, including an uncanny likeness of the recently deceased Matthew Burke hanging in an elevator shaft. Among the grand opening visitors are Sue and her boyfriend Scott. Scott is an aspiring sculptor and friend to Mr. Sidney Wallace. Like all the other patrons, Sue and Scott are enraptured by the lifelike sculptures in the museum. But it's the Joan of Arc exhibit that Sue takes a particular interest in. You see, Jared's new Joan of Arc sculpture looks exactly like Sue's deceased roommate Kathy, whose body, as we know, was stolen from the morgue. Henry overhears Sue's comments on the striking resemblance between Kathy and the new Joan of Arc and explains it away by saying that he saw a picture of Kathy in the newspaper and copied her face. Jared also says that Sue is the spitting image of his Anne Boleyn, the prize piece of the original collection. Jared propositions both Sue and Scott. Sue will model for a new Anne Boleyn sculpture, and Scott will help Jared with sculpting new figures for the museum. Henry has effectively diffused this situation and assuaged Sue's fears for the time being, but there's just something about that Joan of Arc statue that continues to gnaw at her. It doesn't help that very same night she is visited by the burnt-faced man, who swings into her room via hook and rope. Sue wakes up, screams, and the burnt-faced man jumps out the window. At this point, Sue can't be sure whether or not the whole thing was a dream. She believes that the whole thing was merely a flashback brought on by the trauma of losing her friend, but this visit from the burnt-faced man, whether real or imagined, further sticks the idea into her craw that something about that Joan of Arc statue just ain't quite right. Scott takes Sue to a burlesque show where we're treated to some absolutely riveting static shots of dancers kicking their legs towards the camera, and Sue begins to piece things together. She remembers that Kathy had the habit of wearing a single earring in her right ear only, and that the Joan of Arc statue had the very same type of earring. She reasons that there's no possible way that Henry Jared could have picked out such a small detail from a photograph in the newspaper. He'd have to have actually seen Kathy in person. And if he did, it stands to reason that Henry Jared is in cahoots with the burnt-faced man, who again we must reiterate, definitely isn't Henry Jared. Scott's a bit annoyed by the whole idea and takes Sue to see Lieutenant Brennan, the officer in charge of the burnt-faced man investigation, so that Brennan can convince Sue once and for all that the connection between Kathy, the wax sculpture, and Henry Jared is all in her head. And Lieutenant Brennan sides with Scott. By all accounts, Jared is a stand-up guy, if not a bit odd, and he did come look at some of the police photographs of Kathy, which would explain how he knew about the earring. But Sue still isn't convinced, and honestly, neither are the police, as they decide that it's worth a trip to the Wax Museum to make sure that Jared's on the up and up. While there, they notice that the sculpture of John Wilkes Booth also bears a striking resemblance to a deceased acquaintance of theirs, and they also recognize one of Henry's new assistants, Leon, from somewhere, although they can't quite place where from. The coppers bring in Sidney Wallace for questioning, and Wallace inadvertently spills the beans. He gives the cops some information that allows them to recall where they'd seen Leon before. Apparently, he was a prisoner at Sing Sing before earning parole with his artistic talents. And as the saying goes, where there's smoke, there's Wax Museum fires. And at this point, the cops aren't so readily willing to dismiss Sue's theories. They haul in Leon for questioning. At first, he refuses to cooperate, but the police coerce Leon with the promise of a bottle of whiskey. And seeing how Leon is a severe alcoholic that's beginning to suffer the DTs, it's not long before he's laid out the entire thing. Jared has been killing people and stealing their bodies to create wax sculptures, and Sue is his next victim. And unfortunately for Sue, she just so happens to be at the Wax Museum at that very moment. While the police race to the scene to rescue Sue, Scott is already in the midst of full-on fisticuffs with Jared's deaf-mute assistant Igor. Luckily for Scott, the police arrive at the Wax Museum just in time to save him from being decapitated in the guillotine, and it takes what seems like an entire police squadron to subdue the hulking Igor. As this is going on, Jared is prepping Sue to undergo the conversion process from living human to lifelike sculpture. And we don't want to spoil it for you, but get ready for a grand finale complete with drama, suspense, and Vincent Price doling out more than a few ass whoopings along the way.
One of the first things that caught me off guard with this film is just how fresh the script feels despite the fact it's rapidly approaching 70 years old. And given that it's a period film set in 1902, that just makes the freshness all the more surprising to me. It's fast-paced, punchy, and really quite lean given the time it was made. I mean, you've got to imagine, the 50s were the era of the over-explanation. Film productions were still very firmly stuck in the mindset of, it's basically a theatre production that you can shoot from different angles. So to see a film like this, where not only do they largely keep the repetition and over-explanation purely to the more thriller-driven aspects of this script, but the fact that they just keep that pace moving, never letting the ball drop, is something I personally found really impressive. There's a relatively clean 3-act structure, with the first act running from the beginning up to the intermission, the second act running from the opening of Henry's Wax Museum, and the third act starting from around the time Sue agrees to model for Henry's latest wax statue. And while these milestones aren't strictly clean-cut, I feel they transition into each other rather nicely. And there's never any point where it feels clunky or awkward. Equally, it must be said that the character dialogue in this, while maybe just a tiny bit dry in places, for 1953, is pretty bloody impressive. Everything sounds naturalistic, and I, for one, was genuinely impressed with just how natural the dialogue was, both written and performed. So all in all, I thought this was a pretty solid script. Though it probably helped that they were able to effectively readapt the original 1933 version of the script, because it gave them the opportunity to work out any kinks or problems that presented themselves the first time around.
Quite right, Dan. House of Wax is not your typical stodgy 1950s horror film, and I think the script from veteran writer Crane Wilbur has a lot to do with that. When I think 1950s horror, I think stilted dialogue, over-explanation, and possibly some ridiculous plot points that really test the audience's suspension of disbelief. But there's really not much of that to be found here. The dialogue isn't overly stilted. There's no scene wherein a scientist or law enforcement officer monologues to the audience explaining exactly how, why, and where the villain does their dirty work. And despite the fact that House of Wax is about a crazed sculptor turning human bodies into wax figures, the whole thing is surprisingly grounded. As you rightly pointed out, the pacing in House of Wax is quite zippy, and this film must have felt like an absolute scream-a-minute thrill ride for audiences of the time, who were more used to stuff like, say, The Corpse Vanishes or Bela Lugosi Meets a Brooklyn Gorilla. And even with the charmingly archaic intermission, the film never lets up, and I never found myself getting bored. House of Wax was one of 5 films released in 1953 directed by André de Toth, who ironically couldn't experience the film in 3D for himself as he had lost his left eye at an early age. And one could argue that this sort of rapid release assembly line filmmaking tended to produce a lot of films that felt uninspired, to put it gently. But I think having an experienced director at the helm in de Toth, who had mainly worked on the sort of action-packed westerns that were so popular at the time, really helped in keeping House of Wax clipping along at an even pace.
On the subject of direction, what we have here for 1953 is really quite ahead of its time. It's leaning into the theatrical a bit, but here I feel there's a really nice undercurrent of melodrama which suits that theatricality quite well. And on the plus side, the moodier and grander set pieces are absolutely firing on all cylinders. The grander sequences, such as Henry's first wax museum burning down, are captured in what can only be described as mesmerising beauty to me, as you see these horrifying visions of all of these waxworks slowly melting and falling apart. Henry says that these sculptures are like his children, and Toth really does go all out here to make these sequences feel like the entire wax museum is being pulled into hell. The choreography behind the fight scene in that sequence in particular really must have been quite masterful, because one false step on that set and either of the main actors would have gone up in a ball of flames. Equally, the moodier scenes, such as the chase sequences with Sue and Kathy's body being stolen from the morgue, have this wonderful, dark, dimly lit ambience with a smokiness that really goes the extra mile. It reminded me a bit of some of the early Universal horror movies like the fog-filled moors of The Wolfman or the smoggy streets of London After Midnight, but with just the tiniest twist of film noir in there in the form of the shadowy, not entirely clear lighting and directional style that Toth puts on display. He really has done a fantastic job, and it absolutely amazed me just how fresh this film feels in line with its peers. If I didn't know that this was made in 53, I'd have pinned it as late 50s, or maybe even early 60s for just how well the direction holds up. It's not all praise, however. Taking the rough with the smooth, those fantastic set-piece moments are somewhat offset by a more than decent handful of scenes that are just a little bit on the stiff side. I'm talking about the plague of early cinema that was theatrical direction. The idea that your film set is like a theatre stage and that you can just get away with having one camera, sometimes locked, rarely tracking, focused on the centre of a set and then just have your cast come in 1 or 2 at a time, say their lines and walk around the set a little bit with little to no cuts, and what cuts there are just back and forth mid-close-up shots and reverses. I appreciate that this was filmmaking in its infancy still, but it doesn't stop it really flattening out what was, for the most part, some really solid hard-hitting direction that immersed you into the action. So that was a bit of a downer. It must be said, though, that the cast direction is superb, and this is one way in which the theatrical direction trope is somewhat subverted. Because while there are a lot of wides and tracking shots around the individual sets in this movie, Toth makes damn sure that the cast utilise the entire space. And with this movie being the first colour 3D horror movie, the depth created by having the cast fully explore the depths of those sets renders those scenes in 3D almost like a small diorama, which I think is a really nice thing to do here because it makes those theatrical style shot choices much, much nicer on the eyes, and it gives the cast a much greater range of what they can get up to. It's a double-edged sword really, however, because House of Wax kind of bears the brunt of bad technical rendering for most of its release history. But before I dive into the Cine and the 3D in particular, Chris, what did you make of the direction?
I think I'd have to mostly agree with you on the direction, Dan, although I would like to come to the defense of the stage play on celluloid approach just a little bit. As you say, this was a very common thing in the earlier days of cinema. After all, there is a very direct lineage that can be traced from the stage to the silver screen. And while it may seem a bit outdated or contrived to modern audiences, I'd say the fact that it was so ubiquitous for films at the time sort of makes it more of a feature rather than a bug, you know? It's like when you're watching a 70s Italian giallo, you know to expect some day-glow neon blood. Sure, it doesn't look very realistic, but there's a certain comfort and charm in the era-specific quirks, even if they wouldn't pass muster in modern filmmaking. While I agree with you that even in a movie like House of Wax that subverts the trope to a certain extent, that the stagey approach flattens out the film a bit, I have to say, I really don't mind it. In fact, I kinda like it. One of the things that often gets overlooked in horror films is establishing space. In order to build tension and establish stakes, it's very important for the audience to understand the layout of things to get a better comprehension of the situational tension. Knowing the lay of the land helps us understand possible escape routes for our heroes, and it also helps us imagine which dark corners our villains may potentially pop out from. And one thing that all these static wide shots in House of Wax do is help us intimately understand the layout of the Wax Museum, which helps create tension during the climax. Apart from that, I also enjoyed the dark, smoky scenes of the burned-faced man skulking through the back alleys of turn-of-the-century New York City. They're downright moody. There's just something about a nice soundstage alleyway saturated with fog that I absolutely love. It's an image that's persisted from early silent films all the way up to the modern day because, well, it just works. What's interesting about the scene in which Burke burns down the Wax Museum is that the crew actually lost control of the fire during this scene. You mentioned that the Wax Museum also seemed as if it were being pulled into hell, and you're really not too far off the mark, as the fire literally burned a hole in the soundstage and apparently singed Vincent Price's magnificent eyebrows. And as all of this was going on, Detoth just kept on filming even after the fire department had arrived and started dousing the flames, since he knew that this was his one shot to get some footage of the melting sculptures. And it's because of Detoth's dedication to the craft that we ended up with a really beautiful and dramatic depiction of that pivotal scene.
On the Cine front, for me, it's a game of two halves. Compositionally, I love it. I think this film has some absolutely art-worthy shot compositions on show. While it is a little scattershot at times with sequence structure, there are just some framings here that, for the 50s, are astounding and really showcase horror in otherwise non-conventional ways. Yes, you have the disfigured prosthetics, but even shots like the melting wax figures, the scenes recreated in the House of Horrors, and even the race against time tension in the third act are all shot in such a way that just looks absolutely gorgeous. And the colour scheme being rather muted towards mild oranges, greys and greens really helps add a dreamy overtone to what's already a quite surreal looking picture. On the other hand, speaking more generally about the sequence's structures, they're functional. I don't know, I wish there were a lot more shots built into the sequences. There are times where I wish they'd really get a lot closer in on the action, and there are moments here where Toth and the crew zigged when I personally would have zagged. There's no bad structures here sequence-wise. If anything, I just wish they were a bit more diverse to really help sell some of those smaller but important moments a little bit better.
The use of color in House of Wax is superb. It's not as lushly colored as the Hammer horror films or Italian gialli that would come later, but I do think the use of color in House of Wax ends up having a similar effect to the use of color in those more well-known films. As you said, House of Wax has a sort of surreal look to it. When you take the artificial-looking sets of the film, the theatrical direction, and the bizarre plot, and then you slather it in a demure yet equally implausible color palette full of Pepto-Bismol pinks, earthy oranges, and uniformly slate grays, what you get is a sort of uneasy irreality. At no point during the film are you convinced that you're watching anything other than a film, because almost every aspect of the production screams, "This isn't real." But at the same time, that detachment from reality is what makes everything feel just a little bit unsettling, and I think the use of color is doing a lot of the legwork in that regard. In terms of sequence structures and shots, I agree with you, Dan. They didn't wow me, and in fact, this is one of the parts where the 3D becomes a detriment to the film. There are overly long shots of paddle balls or dancers' legs coming towards the screen that clearly only exist to show off the 3D gimmick, and they really feel as though there was very little thought put into them beyond that. Now, of course, this isn't an issue that's unique to House of Wax. You see it in pretty much any 3D film from any era. But these moments are the only ones in House of Wax that I felt slowed down the breakneck pace of the film. And I think the uninspired point-and-shoot Cine in the 3D gimmick sequences has a lot to do with that, particularly if, like me, you didn't watch the 3D version of the film, because at that point, you're just watching static shots of can-can dancers dancing, which may have passed for entertainment in turn-of-the-century New York City, but I can't say it was all that thrilling for me.
So, House of Wax, as mentioned, was the first full-colour 3D horror film in America, and it was shot utilising a technique not too dissimilar from modern 3D. It was known as Natural Vision 3D, and as far as I can tell, the way it worked was that two film projectors would be set up to run the film at the same time with a very slight delay on one of the projectors, and both would be focused on the same screen with a slight overlap. When viewed with a special pair of glasses, the murky, overlapped image would create the illusion of depth. It was first used in the film Buona Devil, effectively a nature documentary, and Warner Brothers saw how successful it was and tried to transpose it into studio films. The results were kind of mixed. The biggest problem was syncing the two projectors to play the footage at the same time. It was always a Herculean effort to get them to both keep pace with each other, and if one projector accidentally balked its print or any other number of film issues occurred that threw one of the projectors out of sync with the other, that was it. Your film for that reel was screwed and you just wouldn't get 3D. A lot of places wouldn't show it in 3D just purely to avoid the inevitable pain in the arse that followed it. In 1971, the film was then re-released and reprocessed into a much more common red-blue 3D that most of us know. But this also had problems, namely that red-blue 3D is a bit cheap and cheerful and doesn't really do justice to the film, as it's kind of a one-size-fits-all process. It also comes with the problem of it basically removing all the lovely colour apart from red and blue. Plus it can be quite headache-inducing. But for the longest time, that's what most people just assumed House of Wax looked like. In fact, it wasn't until the recent Blu-ray re-release that an attempt to present the film in stereoscopic 3D managed to achieve an effect that's negligibly close enough to the original Natural Vision to show just how good the 3D really was. Personally, I'd say if you can watch this film in 3D, go for it, because it really does pull a lot of detail and charm up to the surface that really gets lost in the 2D version. That, and it makes the 3D gimmicks much more tolerable, because they actually have meaning in the 3D version. Performance-wise, there's a really solid turnout. Price really gets a meaty role here, being asked to play a gentle creative type, a weakened artist trying to rebuild, and a totally malevolent character, both with a silent menace and a turn in a very sinister speaking role. He really owns this role. He's ace. Equally, Phyllis Kirk is simply wonderful as Sue Allen. At first you think she's just going to be screamy and irritating, but she quickly develops into a real sleuth. And while she ultimately gets her gotcha taken off her, this film would definitely fail the Bechdel test, for the time we're with her, she's a great leading actor and really gives a more than decent performance. The biggest "what?" moment of this film for me had to be Carolyn Jones' almost unrecognisable appearance in this as Kathy Gray. She's obviously best known for playing Morticia Addams in the original run of The Addams Family, but to see her playing a slightly ditzy, fun-loving blonde about town rendered her so unrecognisable that it was only when I was putting the notes together for this review that I realised she was even in this movie. So goddamn, she really impressed me with this one. I'm now convinced she's a shapeshifter.
Agreed on all counts. Price is very much doing his thing in this one, and Kirk turns in a performance that is quite a bit better than you'd expect for her character given the time period. Of course, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the performance from future B-movie mainstay and personal favorite of mine, Charles Bronson, here credited under his given name Charles Bruczynski. Bronson had been working in small, uncredited television roles for some years prior, but House of Wax is Bronson's first role of any substance, and it's quite funny to me to think that the man who had become known for portraying the strong silent types in films such as Once Upon a Time in the West, Hard Times, and of course the Death Wish franchise, would, in his very first major role, play a character that is the strong and silent archetype taken to an almost comical extreme. As Price's muscle-bound mute assistant Igor, Bronson turns in an admirable performance for a character whose defining traits are quite literally that he is strong and silent. Of course, he has no lines, but Bronson does a nice bit of physical acting in this one and really manages to exude a certain menace without ever uttering a word. Apart from the performances that Dan and I have already called out, well, they're not terrible, but they are very of their time. Paul Picerni as Scott Andrews, along with Frank Lovejoy and Dabbs Greer as the policeman trying to solve the mystery of the Wax Museum, are all just sort of there. They're all very much playing the strong-jawed 50s-men types that were ubiquitous in horror and sci-fi films of the time. Again, they're not poor performances, all things considered, but they're nothing to write home about either.
Finally, the soundtrack. And man, oh man, this soundtrack's the clotted cream of horror scores. It's rich, thick orchestral work at its finest. Seriously, the string arrangements in this film are next level, and they give the more horror-driven elements an almost melting quality, which perfectly punctuates those loss-of-control moments that happen throughout the film. Quite honestly, this is one I really wish I could get the vinyl release for.
Yes, it's quite a shame that the sweeping, epic orchestral score from David Buttolph is ripe for the Waxwork Records reissue treatment. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem that the score for House of Wax has seen a release on any format, ever. I'd venture to say that the original masters no longer exist, which is a pity really, as I too would love to get my hands on a copy of Buttolph's grandiose accompaniment.
House of Wax, to me, is a frighteningly modern feature for its time. While it may have some faults, they're very minor in the grand scale of things and never eclipse what is ultimately a very enjoyable film to sit through. With a gorgeous score, some brilliant performances, keen direction and a solid script, I really can't recommend it enough.
House of Wax was a pleasant surprise for me. Oddly enough, even though I've joined Dan for this review, kicking off a string of Vincent Price film reviews, truth be told, I'm really not that well versed in the man's work. When sitting down to watch a horror film from the 1950s, there's a certain set of expectations that go along with that. And while I can't say that House of Wax completely transcends the trappings of the era or genre, I will say that in this case, it doesn't really matter. House of Wax is a very charming film, bolstered by a cast and crew who were really doing their darndest to make a fun and thrilling horror movie. And nearly 70 years on, I can still say that they've succeeded, and for that, I just have to recommend this one.
Chris, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us again today. As always, it's been an absolute delight. And if people have enjoyed hearing you today, where are they best looking for you?
Well, thank you, Dan, for having me. As I said up top, I hosted the now-defunct Channel 83 podcast. If anyone's interested in hearing me ramble on about obscure horror films that nobody cares about, you can stop by channel83.video to listen to that. I highly suggest you check out our episode on the 1986 film Star Crystal. as we were joined by a very special guest that subscribers to this channel just might be familiar with. As for current projects, I'm the co-host of the Podgasari podcast, a show that's all about taking a look at kaiju films through a political lens. And be on the lookout for some videos from my upcoming Channel 83 YouTube channel.
Lovely stuff. And if you head into the description, you'll find links to all of those. Thanks again, and we'll see you guys next week when, well, let's just say the next film we'll look at will give you the shivers. Wait a minute, no, that's not right. It should be the tingles. Tingles! Who's been screwing with this thing?